Hi, this is Dominic again with Easynomics, and this is going to be part two of our discussion regarding the short-run aggregate supply curve. In the previous video, we went over why the SRAS curve is upward sloping, and we saw that there is a direct relationship between the price level and the quantity of aggregate supply. So we saw that if we're at PL1, the entrepreneur is incentivized to produce at Y1, a quantity of aggregate supply at Y1. And the SRAS curve is reflective of the marginal cost of production at Y1, which would include the cost of paying rent for land resources, interest for capital resources, and wages for labor resources. And so the sum of the cost of employing land, capital, and labor resources as inputs generates the output, which is equal to the short-run aggregate supply curve, this aggregate supply of outputs in the macroeconomy. So we see that this red line is the costs of production of employing land, capital, and labor, and up to point C, the firm stops because they're going to sell it at the price or the average price of all goods and services in the economy at PL1. And we see that the entrepreneur here is motivated to run their business because they will derive a form of income called profit. And profit is the difference between the price that the firm receives when they sell the product to the household minus their cost of production. So in a sense, the shaded area, this shaded blue area, A, is kind of the profit margin for the entrepreneur. And we saw that as the price rises from PL1 to PL2, the entrepreneur is incentivized to increase the quantity of aggregate supply along their short-run aggregate supply curve, increasing outputs from Y1 to Y2 because they can increase their profits. So we see that they incur more costs, more marginal costs of production at point D, but when they sell it at a price of PL2, price minus costs provides greater profit, the sum of area A and B. So that's a quick review from the previous video. In this video, we're going to look at the determinants of the short-run aggregate supply curve. What causes the SRAS curve to shift outward or inward? So that's our goal in this video, to discuss that. And to discuss that, we're going to hold price constant. So the PL2, we're going to take out. And we're just going to look at prices in this economy at PL1 and look at what forces would cause the aggregate supply curve to shift outward and to shift inward. Okay, so let's go ahead and take care of this. All right, so short run in macroeconomics, the period of time when prices of resources are constant. And the prices of resources, land, the price of that would be rent, capital, interest, labor, wages paid by the firm. These are all costs of production to the firm and the entrepreneur driven by the profit. Now we're going to start looking at what happens in the long run. So we can state that in the long run, in macroeconomics is the period of time when prices of resources can change. Okay, so it's when the prices of resources change. We'll use the symbol delta, the math symbol for change. So what happens when there's a change in rent, or a change in interest, or a change in wages? That will affect the input costs for the firm, and thus that will affect the short-run aggregate supply curve. So let's say that wages begins to rise. If wages begins to rise, what will happen to the costs of production? Or if we say interest or rent, wages, if any of these resource prices change, then it's going to impact the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is the sum of all of these input costs. So let's just assume that in the long run, land resources start to rise in cost. So the rent is causing the S1 curve to increase because rent is now rising in the macroeconomy. And let's say that the interest on capital resources is also rising, so the S2 would be rising as a result. And let's say that wages start to rise, perhaps minimum wage is instituted, so that would also cause, in this case, the SRAS1 curve, which we could say is equal to S3, which is reflective of the wages, would also cause this curve to rise. This would be the same thing as saying that it is shifting inwards. Okay? But perhaps it's, you're able to better understand this by seeing that the costs of production are rising. As a result, the supply curve is rising, which is the same as saying that it's shifting inward. So if any of the resource prices change, rent, interest, wages, then the SRAS curve is going to shift. Okay? So let's make some notes regarding what causes the SRAS curve to shift. So the factors that cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. And that would include, number one, change in wages. Changes in wages, which is derived from firms employing labor as a cost of production. If there's a change in wage, whether it goes upwards, typically upwards, you probably not see wages falling, hopefully, in an economy, but it could happen. If there's a change in wages, then that will impact the SRAS curve. It will shift upward or downward with the change in the wage. Number two, any change in any of the other resources, change in capital and or land resources would lead to interest. Interest is the form of income, paid for capital. Change in interest for capital or change in rent for land would also lead to a shift in the SRAS curve. Number three, changes, let's say, in corporate or business taxes. Right? Taxes are an additional cost of production. So if taxes rise, the SRAS curve will rise with it. If taxes fall, the SRAS curve will shift downward with that change. Number four, if there is a change in subsidies, and this is you can see that how microeconomics helps us in macroeconomics. Change in subsidies, as we studied in microeconomics. Change in subsidies offered to firms, right? If there's a large amount of subsidies offered to a large amount of firms in the national economy, that could affect the aggregate supply curve. And in microeconomics, we see that subsidies reduce the cost of production, so it can cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift outwards with more subsidies provided, or if the government cuts subsidies, then the SRAS curve would be shifting in with that change. And last, if there are supply shocks, right? Perhaps, let's say during the COVID pandemic, you might have some businesses that had inputs supplied from other countries. Let's say inputs supplied from China, and if there were factories in China that were in lockdown and workers could not work in those factories to create the inputs that were needed by other firms in other nations, then that would be a shock. There would be a reduction in the supply of those needed inputs, perhaps a reduction in land inputs or capital inputs, and that would cause the SRAS curve to shift in. So typically, supply shocks cause the SRAS curve to shift in. Some cases, it could cause it to shift out. Maybe you have unusually great warm weather for agriculture, and you have a lot of agricultural outputs being generated in a nation that's dependent on the agricultural industry, and the SRAS curve could shift outward. Okay, so this is very important. The factors that cause the SRAS curve to shift are the changes in wages, the changes in capital or land resources, the interest and rent payments that firms make to acquire these resources, changes in corporate taxes, changes in subsidies offered to firms, and supply shocks. So just to illustrate this, we're going to go ahead and just simplify what we mean by that. Okay, so just to clear up the model slightly, again, we're going to hold the price level constant at PL1. The price on average of final goods and services is at PL1, and we have the firm producing at point C, and their quantity of aggregate supply is at Y1, and we can go ahead and get rid of this. Okay. And we know that at Y1, the firm is employing land resources and they're paying rent. So the distance from the x-axis to point A is the cost of employing rent. Then the distance from point A to point B is the cost of employing capital resources. They're paying interest for that. And the distance from point B to point C is the cost of paying wages to use labor. So the sum of all these inputs provides the SRAS curve, which is the outputs, all of the final goods and services produced in an economy. Now let's assume that wages increases. Right? We're going to say that wages are rising and perhaps capital resources are rising and land resources are rising. So that would cause, as stated at the beginning of the video, the S1 curve to rise, which are the land costs, the capital resources to rise, and also the labor costs to rise. So what would happen? The SRAS curve would be shifting upwards, which is the same as saying that it is shifting inwards. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that. So here is the SRAS curve. Okay. SRAS shifting upwards or inwards from SRAS1 to SRAS2 because of a change in the costs of production. So if the price level is constant at PL1, then we would see that the firm would have to reduce production from Y1 to this point, Y2. So we see that the rise in the cost of production reduces the supply. It shifts inwards, SRAS1 to SRAS2, and the firm, instead of producing at point C, will now produce at point D, reducing the quantity, or reducing the aggregate supply of final goods and services from Y1 to Y2 because of those additional costs of production. All right. What would happen if the cost of productions went down? So we're going to go ahead and illustrate that, and I'm going to clear up this model so we can better see that. All right, so I've cleared up the model to help us better see this. And now we're going to assume that wages, cost of labor is falling, capital and land resources are falling. It's cheaper for firms to employ these resources, and as a result, we would expect the aggregate supply curve to shift outward. Right? So as those prices falls, we would see something like this, the SRAS curve shifting downward, which is the same as saying it's shifting outward. From SRAS1, if that is our starting point, to SRAS3 in this case. Again, notice that the price level is constant. There is no change in the price level. Instead, we see that there's a change, in this case, in the cost of production. So the firm would be able to generate more output. right, at this point here. Going from point C to, let's say, point E, or Y3, increasing real GDP from Y1 to Y3. I can go ahead and get rid of this old line that we used previously to better see what we're talking about here. Okay. So again, if the cost of production goes down, it's the same as saying that the SRAS curve is shifting downward or shifting outward. Same concept. And thus we see the determinants of SRAS. Any change in wages, changes in capital and land resources, changes in corporate taxes, changes in subsidies. We learned this in microeconomics. Taxes cause the supply curve to shift in. Subsidies cause the supply curve to shift outward. And supply shocks, typically causing the SRAS curve to shift inward. These changes cause the SRAS curve to shift. Price level is constant, it's not changing. So this is another factor that's impacting the SRAS curve, which are what we've listed here. You can shift inward from SRAS1 to SRAS2. Thus, the firm reduces production from point C to point D, or from Y1 to Y2. Or perhaps the firm's able to employ more resources because the cost of those resources are falling, so they can increase SRAS from SRAS1 to SRAS3, increasing production from point C to point E at the same price level, or increasing real GDP from Y1 to Y3. And that's it. So if you have any questions, feel free to comment, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.